All right, everyone, welcome back to another YouTube video. We are going to address a specific question today, and in the future, I'm just going to make single videos addressing single questions because it gives me a little bit of room to go in depth specifically on whatever question, as well as just make videos a little bit more frequently since it's an easier format to actually edit. So the question we're going to talk about today is, should you use full range of motion in every exercise? And this is something that gets tossed around a lot from a black and white standpoint, meaning there are people that say, oh, use full range of motion across every single exercise. And then there are people that are like, no, full range of motion isn't the thing. We should use partial range of motion because XYZ study says that partial range of motion is better for hypertrophy. So what this answer is ultimately going to come down to is, what is the context of the exercise that you're doing? And within that, specifically, what are the constraints of where your body is in space and where the load is acting against you. So we're going to go over a few specific scenarios, but the first thing we really want to just kind of etch into our brains just before you actually dive into the context of a specific exercise is that the idea of full range of motion needs to be exercise specific, right? So the full range of motion, for instance, at my elbow is different than the range of motion of challenge that's provided to me with a specific exercise. So let's give an example. Two scenarios. The first scenario, I'm doing a standing dumbbell curl, right? So I'm just standing straight up, and let's say I'm doing it single arm, and I'm just doing it by my side like a total gym bro, okay? At different points throughout the range of motion, because of the way that resistance torque changes on the shoulder, which is really just a different conversation all its own, a different video, but the way that the resistance torque changes on the shoulder and on the elbow will vary through the entire range of motion. So as many of you can probably already intuitively know, if I hold the dumbbell here just with my arm extended by my side, there's no work really that my biceps has to do to actually hold the weight there, right? That's mostly just a forearm and a shoulder kind of a thing. But as soon as I start to bend my elbow up, now all of a sudden my biceps pick up tension to actually act against the load that's pulling me down into elbow extension. Okay, so just understanding that basic premise of, well, the full range of motion for the elbow, in terms of this is the full range that I have available to me, is different than where that exercise is loaded. So again, I could hold a dumbbell at my side forever, but would I be able to actually hold the dumbbell here is a completely different story. Okay, so that's one scenario. Another scenario would be if you were doing a cable curl, right? Let's just say you were facing away from the machine and you're doing a curl. It's one of those exercises where like the cable's pulling you back and you're going throughout this range of motion with the cable. Well, in that instance, at the bottom of the movement, because the cable is angled a little bit backward, there actually is some force that is forcing me to use my biceps to prevent my elbow from further extending, and to a degree, muscles of the shoulder girdle. So in those two scenarios, all that was really different was the application, or rather the direction of the loading. So in one case I was using a cable, and in the other I was using a dumbbell. And because a dumbbell just always is going to want to fall directly downward, at the bottom position I had no resistance acting on the biceps, but in the variation where I was using the cable, there was a force that was pulling my arm straight that I actually had to resist. So is there a point, or would there be a point in actually spending time at the bottom in the dumbbell variation? No, not really, if I'm trying to challenge my biceps, at least, and the rest of my elbow flexors. But would there be a reason for me to go to the bottom of the cable curl? Potentially, yes. And if you look at across different studies, one that specifically comes to mind was the full range versus partial range of the skull crusher variation. If you don't know what a skull crusher is, basically just like you're lying down and you're doing extensions like this. The group that used partial range of motion actually experienced greater hypertrophy results as compared to the group that used full range of motion, full again, in that particular exercise. And so when you look at deeper into it and think, okay, well, why might that actually be that the partial range group experience greater levels of hypertrophy, is because in that exercise, in that position where you're just at the top sitting with the dumbbells, there's no tax on the triceps that's forcing me to hold the weight here. So the group that didn't go all the way up to the top weren't actually able to ever rest their triceps because they could just kind of chill with the weight in their hand and not having to do anything. So the group that basically just kept a slight elbow bend and stayed in this range where there was actually challenge given the weight that they were using experience better results because, again, of the constraints of where the load was acting relative to them. If you chose that same exercise and used cables and set the cables up in a way where at that fully extended position, it was still pulling your elbow down, that would be a completely different story. So again, this discussion of full range needs greater context overall, and the context, again, will depend on the specific exercise and the specific direction and application of loading. Just one more example. Take a regular barbell squat. Think about how difficult it is at the top of the movement relative to the bottom, right? Much more difficult in the bottom. So is it worth, in this particular instance, if I'm training for hypertrophy, to come all the way up to the top? That's probably a decision that you have to make based on the amount of load that you're using, what specifically you're trying to do with the exercise. But for the most part, I would encourage most of you just to play around with where you feel the most amount of tension in the movement, which again, in the example of the squat would be at the bottom, and probably limiting your range toward the top, not so much as so you're never coming to the top, but just that you're not spending that much time there. Because again, spend time where there's tension. Don't use full range for no specific reason. We want to use the full range of challenge of every exercise that we do, not just the full range at that joint. Hope that helps.